The future I'd like to see is a future where everybody works together.
In Glasgow, we are looking for action.
Hamidolphus agus Hamikretching Gnurin Glasgow Gayanu.
Everyone needs to step up. It's all our responsibility.
You speak up for what's right.
Action has to be taken now.
It is possible for everyone to make a difference.
Bring your A game to Glasgow. That we cannot ever win only by talking.
There is no doubt that we all can make a difference.
The biggest responsibility lies on decision makers.
Together we can fight this.
I'm ready.
I'm ready.
Jeg er klar.
Watch it, I'm ready.
Hello and welcome to the road to COP26, opportunities, challenges, and Africa's transition to net zero. My name is Eleni Jokos. I'm a correspondent and anchor for CNN and delighted to be joining you for this virtual event live from the Absa offices here in Sandton. And thank you to all of you for joining us from all corners of the earth. Our hashtags today, because that is the most important thing, we'd love for you to engage with us on social media, share your thoughts and ideas. It's Climate Action Africa and Absa Role in Society. Right, so Absa has partnered with the Group of 30 and other stakeholders, including CNN, to host this critical dialogue as we prepare for COP26 in November later this year. It is vital that African leaders are not only heard, but also have a substantial influence as climate change goals and policies are designed and implemented. In Africa, the stakes are high, from floods to droughts and extreme weather patterns, which are attributed to climate change. They are impacting livelihoods across the continent. All the while, the continent has contributed the least to global warming, accounting for 4% of global emissions. But the continent is gearing for economic growth. It's going to be powered by industrialization, the increase of value chains, and the building of more infrastructure. So African leaders, whether in the public or private sector, now have a choice. They can build a greener future and a greener continent. The session over the next hour or so will explore how African governments can finance and also contribute to delivering a sustainable planet for future generations, and as well as the role of the private sector in helping to ensure that net zero goals are actually achieved. So we will be giving you an opportunity to send your questions through and your thoughts. Please take a look at your team's chat box and start typing those up. All right, so we're going to be heading into a panel discussion in a short while, but first we have keynote addresses, and we'll be hearing from some of our thought leaders who will be setting the scene and also giving us an overview of their current efforts. I'd like to now hand over to Daniel Mminele, the Absa Group CEO. He took over in January 2020. just before the start of the pandemic. And this is after 5 years as Deputy Governor at the Reserve Bank of South Africa. He's also got ample experience in the banking sector in South Africa, in the UK and Germany. Daniel, great to have you with us. And thank you so much for this opportunity to have this vital discussion.
Thanks, Eleni. Excellencies, distinguished guests, our esteemed clients, partners and colleagues. Allow me to add my own welcome to that of Eleni's to you for this event on behalf of the Absa Group. We are delighted to be hosting this important conversation with our friends from the G30. Building on the G30 report, mainstreaming the transition to a net zero economy, today we're putting the lens on the African continent when it comes to the critical issues of climate change transitions as we prepare for the 26th UN Climate Change Conference taking place in Glasgow later this year. Our objective with this interaction is to foster the important public-private debate on the challenges and the opportunities that arise from Africa's transition to net zero. As a continent, and Eleni has touched on some of these issues just now, we're particularly vulnerable to the many threats posed by climate change, and we've already experienced more regular and extreme floods, famines, droughts, plagues, and the impact that these have on lives and livelihoods on the continent. It therefore remains vital for the African voice to be heard and African perspectives to be taken into account as issues of how we shape a just transition are discussed at COP26 in Glasgow. As we start this conversation, allow me to touch on three themes that I believe are vital to support Africa's transition. Firstly, there is a significant need for global cooperation on financing Africa's transition. Widespread resource mobilization is required to enable a just transition, and in line with the Paris Agreement, support in the form of transfers is required from advanced economies to lower income countries. These resources will enable lower income countries to leapfrog into using green technologies and help enhance climate resilience, which will ultimately support a global stability. And green concessional funding will also be a powerful tool to leverage in support of the transition to a green economy on the African continent. The second point to make from an emerging market and African perspective is around how we achieve a just transition. Many countries on the continent are still highly dependent on fossil fuels, which provide both revenue and employment. Thus, we need to strike a defensible balance as we move forward, because some of these countries may even argue that fossil fuels are critical for their development, such that they may say that securing energy supply and accessing electricity in the first place is more critical initially than worrying about the cleanliness of it. That's why financing, burden sharing, incentivization become critical to ensuring that we avoid significant unintended consequences on lives and livelihoods of people, and ensuring that a more holistic, a differentiated approach is taken. So our efforts must focus on a just transition that helps us limit the social, political, and economic costs of transitioning to net zero, while at the same time promoting sustainable development. The last point I'd like to make is just how important a role businesses have to play in mitigating global warming, and they need to be supported, appropriately supported by the broader regulatory community. Investments in renewable energy solutions, energy efficiency measures, and improved business practices can decrease the carbon footprint of businesses. And it is actually quite encouraging to see that there's a growing number of corporates in Africa that are looking to self-generate power, especially those targeting sort of carbon neutrality. So this is a good step in the right direction, and it is critical that we see more of this going forward. Another point is research and investment into new technologies that support a global transition, which are equally vital. As far as financial institutions are concerned, they can contribute by both decreasing their own carbon footprints, as well as by developing innovative climate finance products and solutions to support their clients on their own transition journeys. On that note, let me welcome my esteemed panel and look forward to engaging on this very important and urgent global issue and how it pertains to Africa. Thanks, Eleni.
Thanks very much, Daniel. Thank you for sharing those thoughts with us, and look forward to engaging with you during our panel discussion. Joining us now from London, we have Mark Carney, a Special Envoy for Climate Action and Finance, United Nations co-chair of the G30 Working Group. After a 13-year career with Goldman Sachs in various cities across the world, Mark Carney has served both as Governor and Deputy Governor of the Bank of Canada. Mark, great to have you with us.
Great to be here, Eleni, and thank you to CNN, and thank you, Daniel, for hosting this very important discussion. It's a great pleasure to share the virtual stage with my good friends and esteemed colleagues, Tidjane and Vera. Listen, as you alluded to in the opening remarks, Eleni, no region of the world has done less to cause climate change, and no area is more affected by it. I want to spend a few minutes talking about the core financial agenda and how it can impact climate mitigation and improve resilience in Africa. Now, the bit that I work on for COP26 is the private finance agenda, and our core objective is to build a framework so that every financial decision takes climate change into account. But achieving the objectives of the Paris Agreement, in other words, limiting global temperature increases to well below 2 degrees centigrade from pre-industrial levels, will require a whole economy transition, and it will require a global transition. The good news is that in recognition of the scale of the task, over 125 countries, including more than half of the G20, have now committed to net zero by 2050 at the latest, and all countries are in the process of coming forward with ambitious 2030 climate plans, so-called NDCs. You can expect important announcements later this week at President Biden's Leaders Summit, and we expect momentum to build through the balance of the year. So in other words, countries are increasingly responding to the demands of their citizens, demands we saw in that opening video, and trying to live up to the rights of future generations. And it's the role of finance, too, to respond. And that will require all forms of finance. That means public finance to support the development of the critical infrastructure needed for the transition. It means finance to build climate resilient infrastructure to withstand the changes that we've already wrought, and also finance to support the just transition that Daniel spoke of a moment ago. It will require development and blended finance to support adaptation and resilience, and to develop new markets for private finance by de-risking investment. And very importantly, it will require mainstreaming private finance to help all companies realign their business models for net zero. Private finance, in other words, will turn billions of public investment into trillions. So let me start with a few words on cooperation, as Daniel put it. And the bedrock for climate finance is the $100 billion per year by 2020 commitment that was first made in Copenhagen, reaffirmed in Paris. And this is a flow from developed to developing countries. Securing that commitment in action is a top priority for the UK COP presidency in Glasgow. Now, bilateral climate finance is the source of almost all concessional climate finance, and it's vital to shore up the integrity, the solidity, and predictability of financial flows for adaptation and mitigation in developing countries. All bilateral donors must live up to their climate finance commitments and will need to set more ambitious targets for the period ahead. Multilateral vehicles of concessional finance, such as the Green Climate Fund, as well as non-dedicated funds such as IDA, the African Development Fund or the Asian Development Fund, and the concessional windows of the multilateral development banks will play important roles in providing direct and catalytic support to developing countries, particularly in Africa. An ambitious replenishment of these funds will be important over the coming years, given their importance in boosting mitigation and adaptation and enabling MDBs and development finance institutions more broadly to support private investment. Now, what's critical is that DFIs, development finance institutions, and multilateral development banks fully align their operations with the goals of the Paris Accord. In other words, the momentum that I'm going to speak of in a moment, the momentum that exists in the private sector, must be matched by the international multilateral development institutions. They are uniquely placed to address the financing gap for mitigation, adaptation, and resilience in Africa, including by de-risking projects and leveraging private finance. And the G20 meeting scheduled for July in Venice represents a major opportunity for these institutions to define their contributions to COP26 by making clear how they'll use their resources and expertise to support the creation of a credible pipeline of investable projects for mitigation, adaptation, and resilience in developing economies. Their focus should be on bearing the risks that the private sector cannot, and leveraging private capital so that the scale of finance needed for climate mitigation and adaptation begins to flow. Now, the international community has begun exploring all options to enhance the envelope of international public finance, including through innovative and alternative sources of finance. Very promising in this respect is the IMF's proposal for large additional SDR allocations of an equivalent of 650 billion US dollars. UK Chancellor and the rest of the G7 have endorsed this sizable allocation of SDRs. And in order to ensure that those SDRs go to countries that need them the most, and IMF member countries with strong external positions should voluntarily reallocate their existing SDRs. It will also be critical to tackle debt distress and the excessive debt overhang, especially in the most climate vulnerable economies. And it's welcome that G20 countries have extended the DSSI program to provide further temporary relief to a targeted set. A more permanent solution should be found. Ultimately, meeting the commitments in the Paris Agreement will require a vast and fundamental shift in private finance and in the financial system as a whole. The good news is there's now enormous momentum in the private financial sector for climate action, and private capital is scaling up rapidly to finance the transition. Our strategy for COP26 has a simple objective, as I said earlier, to ensure that every professional financial decision takes climate change into account. And to this end, we're working with the private sector and other stakeholders to develop 4 pillars of sustainable finance. The first is reporting, improving the quantity, quality, and comparability of climate-related financial disclosures by making the TCFD mandatory. This will build the right framework so the private sector can allocate capital and manage risks and seize climate opportunities. Already, 34 companies from across Africa, from South Africa to Tunisia, have joined the TCFD, and central banks are working to implement robust disclosures in line with the TCFD, for example, the Kenyan Central Bank, and encouraging pathways to embed TCFD disclosures across the financial system. The second pillar is risk management, and that is, in essence, ensuring that the financial sector can measure and manage climate-related risks. The central banks of Tunisia, Morocco, South Africa, the Central Bank of the West African states have all joined what's called the Network for Greening the Financial System, a group of over 80 central banks that is developing the capacity to better manage climate risks and to seize the opportunities that arise from combating climate change. And those opportunities are the third pillar, returns, which is to help investors identify what they can gain from the transition to net zero and how they can report their own portfolio's alignment to the transition. The scale of investment opportunities are enormous, $3 trillion in Africa this decade alone. Some of this will be met by dedicated sustainable investment flows, such as the green bond market, a market that has grown in just a few years to hundreds of billions of dollars in new issuance, including by some African issuers. However, we won't get to net zero in a niche. Climate finance must mainstream. And that's why it's so significant that the world's largest asset owners controlling over $30 trillion, have joined the race to zero, the gold standard for the net zero transition plans and targets. We need even more to join these standards, including ambition from insurers and banks. We can expect progress very soon. I'll finish by mentioning a mobilization market. To ensure that we need to develop new market structures in order to ensure that the flows go to emerging economies and developing economies. And one of the most important will be a market for carbon offsets, voluntary market for carbon offsets. 90% of the demand for those offsets will come from advanced economies. 90% of the supply will come from developing economies, including in Africa. This is a market that can scale quickly to $100 billion per annum. With that, I'll finish by emphasizing that all of this will be reinforced by credible and predictable public policies. The market for transition is being built. We must further increase our ambition and use every second in the road to Glasgow in order to achieve what our economies require. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. I'd like to now head to Kigali. We have Tidjane Thiam, Chairman of the Rwanda Finance Limited Steering Committee and member of the Financing Africa Summit 2021, joining us now. Tidjane is a French Ivorian banker who has served as the CEO of Credit Suisse until February 2020. Prior to this role, Thiam was the Chief Financial Officer of Prudential. He's also the AU Special Envoy on COVID-19. Tidjane, welcome.
Thank you, Eleni. Pleasure to be here. I'm actually in Paris, so I wish I was in Kigali, but I'm not. Look, thank you to CNN, to you, Eleni, to Absa for giving me a chance to address this very important topic with my good friend Mark, who's been providing great leadership on this issue, and Vera Songwe. Mark has already covered a lot of ground, so I will pick on a few points and a few issues, starting with an observation, which is that I think that COVID has been an example and an illustration of why public goods, why global public goods are important, why multilateral coordination is important, and about the interconnectedness of our world. And I do hope that some of the painful lessons learned in that experience can transfer to how we look at the climate change issue, which is a typical issue that requires massive coordinated action, country by country, but also at the global level. I want to say a few words about the strategy to follow, but also the question of resources, which Mark has quite broadly addressed already. But let's start maybe with the challenges of Africa. Africa in the last 20 years had a very strong and a broad expansion of its economy, improving the livelihood of Africans across the continent. Unfortunately, the COVID pandemic has been a real shock with its impact on exports, on tourism, the lockdowns and their impact on activity. All that has contributed to create a tough situation for African countries. So as you said earlier, Eleni, the stakes are high, from the need to fund vaccines, to protect our populations, to the need to not jeopardize 20 years of hard work, of sustained reforms, which allowed Africa to grow. The stakes are very high. And when one talks about climate change, the conventional wisdom is often that Africa has not contributed a lot to the rise in temperature. But I think that that's slightly mistaken, and that it is absolutely a huge issue for Africa. Africa has been hugely impacted by climate change in a negative way, whether it's through the extension of the deserts and the lack of rain. Mark was reminding earlier people of how little of African agriculture takes place in irrigated areas. Most of it is rain dependent. So the impact of climate on African economies and African livelihoods is direct and very major. That's one. And two, if you think that various studies tell you that we're going to need to create something like 450 million jobs for our youth in the next 20, 30 years, that increase in population is also likely to completely change the environmental equation in Africa, with massive increases in population, but also in demand, particularly for energy, and for things which are potentially in the short term, huge pressures in the short term, but are potentially risky for the environment. So if we move to the strategies and what can countries do, the Group of 30 report emphasized that each country must develop its own strategy, and which has to be, and two words are important, predictable and credible, meaning also that the actions of the countries have to be compatible with the general statements made about climate change. Any of those strategies must involve the private sector in a very significant way, and I'll come back to that, and also contain net zero commitments, net zero ideally by 2050 commitments, as well as a commitment to improve disclosures, something that Mark has also emphasized. I mean, it's clear that markets are reacting to this. The cost of weather-related insurance has been multiplied by 8 over the last 10 years. So this is a current broad issue for all countries, developing and developed. So let's say a word, maybe, allow me to say a word about the resources. I think that the recent IMF increase in SDRs at 650 billion is a game changer. And the US administration played a big role in delivering this after intense lobbying last year of all the African head of states and the African Union Special Envoys. And that's a major development. But what we need now is additional resources. And as Mark said, it's very important that the countries, a lot of developed countries will benefit from that 650 billion. A lot of them are in surplus positions. So the key lobbying point now is that for those countries to allocate part of that surplus to Africa. That's probably the single biggest financial issue we have now. There are a number of important international meetings coming, particularly the May 18th conference in Paris with President Macron and many G7 heads of state. It will be very important to continue to push for that reallocation of surpluses to happen, because it can release very material resources. The estimate is that the SDR reallocation will release $33 to $34 billion for Africa. This is an additional, very significant level of resource which will be indispensable, because the simple truth of the matter is that that transition that we'll wish for and that Danielle mentioned will not happen without a massive infusion of cash and additional resources to what we've been receiving so far. Maybe a word about the green economy before I conclude. I think that a lot of the discussions about a green economy in Africa underemphasize technology. So I just want to reiterate that technology, including for Africa, not just for developed countries, has a huge potential, and that in that context, digital infrastructure will be key, and that involves, of course, again, blended finance and joint interventions of government and the private sector. And ultimately, the private sector has to play a key role in this. I always advocate the emergence of strong, small and medium-sized domestic African enterprises. That's an absolutely key objective that has not been achieved so far, but will be instrumental to any transformation, because the private sector has a key role to play, from financing to research and development, technology, innovation against climate change. I will end on a few proposals and a political comment. I think the proposals are back to the 650 billion. We need a scale up of concessionary finance from the IMF. We need a trust fund for climate finance. That is really crucial, so that part of those additional resources explicitly go to sustain the long-term effort of countries to promote climate change. And finally, we also need a vaccine facility. I haven't said a lot about vaccines, but really, if we don't meet that vaccine challenge in Africa, none of the long-term perspectives will happen. So my final kind of political comment is really on it's that lady in France. You know, when there was the Gilets jaunes movement, it was largely linked to the introduction of a fuel tax, which was not very well explained. And that lady said to the media, these people are worried about the end of the world, I'm worried about the end of the month. Well, both are important. And the thing that makes this debate particularly challenging for policymakers and leaders is that, what I call that tension between the short term and the long term. The short term, it's the population pressures, it's the need to produce energy, It's all those things that are pressing for growth and must be addressed. The long term is the future of the planet. Now, it's incumbent on leaders to bridge that gap between the short-term pressures and the long-term pressures. And we need to come up with solutions at the global level that do that effectively. And this will be my final comment, in an equitable manner. And that equity must be within countries, must be across countries, but also across time. So with it, I'll pause and give others a chance to continue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tidjane. And it's so true. I mean, what are the priorities right now? So many on the list for the African continent: economic growth, powering up the continent, and we'll discuss some of those key elements that you mentioned in our panel discussion. And we're about to open the panel discussion on opportunities, challenges, and Africa's transition to net zero. And I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Vera Songwe, the Executive Secretary of the Economic Commission for Africa, United Nations Under Secretary General. Dr. Songwe has a strong track record of providing policy advice and delivering on developmental goals. Prior to joining the ECA, she was Regional Director of the IFC, covering West and Central Africa. She's also a member of the African Union Institutional Reform Team under the direction of Rwandan President Paul Kagame. Vera, welcome. I know you're coming to us from Washington, D.C., so good morning to you.
Good morning. Good morning. First of all, let me say thank you to the G30 and Absa, of course, for convening this conversation. Can you see me? No? Yes, maybe. Can you hear me? My camera, I think, is on. Is it on now? Okay. And can you hear me? You should. Okay. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Fantastic, Vera. So we want, do you have opening comments that you'd like to share with us before we head into the panel discussion?
Yes, please. Thank you. No, I think let me take off from where Tidjane ended, with a young girl, not the young woman in Paris, but a young girl in South Africa or any one of our African capitals. When she wakes up in the morning, she needs energy to go to school, to prepare, to get ready for work. She needs energy to cook, and she needs energy to be able to connect from home to work. And that, that young girl today is not able to do all of these things. This young girl does not wake up in the morning thinking green investment or a green climate, a green planet. She's thinking, how can I ensure that myself and my family are prosperous? And I think this is the conversation on the continent today. It really is about how do we generate more prosperity? How do we generate more jobs? How do we ensure that post-COVID, the 100 million people that are at risk of falling into poverty today can come back better and stronger? And I think the solution that we're able to provide is exactly a sustainable solution. It is the growth agenda for the future for the continent. The African Union has just launched a green investment strategy that essentially gives out and lays the framework for how Africa can grow forward better and stronger, as Mark was saying. And I think in part of this strategy, it's not so much about, yes, today, and just to give you in terms of orders of magnitude and comparison, African countries are spending somewhere between 5 to, if you're Mozambique, 9 to 11% of GDP responding to climate crises. We have seen in East Africa, as Mark and Tidjane spoke about, the locust crisis, compounded by drought, compounded with a very sort of heavy rain. So you think to yourself, in Sudan, there's floods, there's a drought in Kenya, there's locusts in Ethiopia and Kenya. And these are the problems for the continent today that we're confronting. And the question then is, how do you respond to those problems? And how can we ensure that we grow in a way benefiting from this crisis better? Mark spoke about the special drawing rights, the SDRs. We're all talking about the SDRs, and we must give credit to the US government, the G7 and G20, for finally approving $650 billion of those special drawing rights. What that will do for the continent is three things. The first one is ensure that the continent has the liquidity to respond just to the crisis. We have not had the benefit of responding in the orders of magnitude of 20%, two-digit % of our GDPs, as the advanced economies have done on the continent. The best we have done is 2% response, but we need a lot more liquidity to be able to ensure that African countries can come out of this crisis better. So getting the SDRs has been a big achievement, but the SDRs, as Tidjane said, are only $33.6 billion. We need a lot more. If we go backwards to COP, it was $100 billion every year. I don't think we'll get that from the public sector because the public sector, as we know, is strained. So the private sector, as Mark said, is where we should look for those resources. Today, the private sector is looking for better investments, is looking for credible investments. The benefit on the continent is that we still have almost 70% of our infrastructure investment that needs to be put in place. So we don't even have the problem of stranded assets. We just need new assets. And all those new assets could be clean, they could be renewable, and they could be sustainable. January 1 of this year, the African Union declared the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. That is Africa's Marshall Plan. Inside that Marshall Plan, I think, as Tidjane said, is a whole logistics segment to move goods from South Africa to Zimbabwe, from Djibouti to Dakar. We are going to need huge logistics, huge rail investments. Those investments are going to have to be sustainable. And I believe that we have a rate of return because by 2030, 1 in every 2 people that will be joining the job market will be from this continent, which means revenues will go up and we will be able to be an important player in the demand market. So therefore, I think the case for why the private sector needs to come to the continent is clear. If you look at the IFC and the World Bank Doing Business Index over the last 6-7 years, Africa has consistently had at least 5 countries in the top 10 of the Doing Business Index. Africans understand that we need to improve our business environment. They are doing it. We are just as good, if not better, in many areas. I think in many of our countries today, reform of the private sector is key. Tidjane spoke about the small and medium enterprise businesses. That is where green investments will play a big role for women on cross-border trading and energy. I think we need to do that. And that's why we're also calling, as Mark and Tidjane have said, for a redistribution of special drawing rights. We hope that if we can redistribute or on-lend, voluntary on-lending of some of the SDRs for investments to blend with or to mix and to reduce the cost with public sector investments, we can probably turbocharge Africa's investments. But we cannot just do this in a sort of binary way, go from sort of fossil fuels to 100% sustainable. There is a just transition in the middle. 23 million women today die from poor cooking fuels. We need better cooking fuels. We know that gas is going to be important as a transition fuel. We know that gas is important even to power clean energy. So I think we need to have a discussion around that and see how we can invest in gas to reduce prices and increase access as we go forward. The African leaders have an agenda. They have a plan for this. And I think that we should be able to move forward. And finally, we join with the IMF to talk about carbon pricing. We've been talking a lot about domestic resource mobilization on the continent. Many of our countries are carbon sinks, particularly in the Congo Basin. We have 3 years of carbon emissions sequestered in the Congo Basin area. We need to be able to provide some remuneration to those in those areas so that we can ensure that they don't destroy the forest and they can continue to protect our planet. So carbon pricing becomes an important element, and we hope that the private sector will come together with us in this conversation. And finally, I cannot agree more with Mark on the issue of transparency in how we measure, monitor, and account for green and sustainable investments. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vera, for those comments. And you're right. Whenever I travel into many African countries and see what happens in remote areas, it's about waking up and figuring out how to put food on the table. And priorities for people that live in remote areas with little resources is about economic prosperity. But here's an opportunity for us to think about climate change for the future generations. And this is why this conversation is absolutely vital. I'd like to welcome back Daniel and Mark and Tidjane so we can get into our panel discussion. And Mark, I'd like to start with you. And given the fact that, look, it seems that, throwing money at our problems always is a good thing, right? It means resources, it means that we can, find solutions. And when we talk about climate financing, and you're alluding to this, how much interest is there in financing climate-related projects on the continent? And have you seen any pullback because of COVID-19 and the fact that many resources have been reallocated as we deal with this other unprecedented crisis facing the world?
Well, I guess I'd slightly amend, Eleni, you're not throwing money at problems, but targeting money at opportunities is probably the best thing, and using the advice of Daniel and others in order to make the case. Look, I think there's two things I'd say on the COVID, and we've all tried to touch on them first, which is that the COVID crisis has absorbed tremendous resources of governments, including African governments. In fact, as Vera suggested, African governments unable to fully respond to COVID because of liquidity and other constraints. And that's why the DSSI, this sort of debt service approach, but very importantly, the SDR allocation, re-lending, those resources that come from there, the other resources are incredibly important. The second, so that's important from an overall COVID response. But the second thing that I'd underscore is what has happened during COVID has been an absolute acceleration in private sector interest in investing in the energy transition. Now, in some jurisdictions, partly in Africa, that energy transition will include gas, and it's important to recognize that. In others, there will be a leapfrog, as Daniel said, to renewable energy technology. In all cases, those types of projects will generate considerable jobs, and it's our job to make sure that the financial terms of those investments are appropriate. But Eleni, I would say that the interest in this type of investment has only multiplied through the COVID period.
You know, you were alluding to the fact that we need a lot more resources and a lot more money to deal with this issue. You know, going back to what Vera had mentioned in terms of the infrastructure gap that's facing the continent can amount to about $170 billion on a yearly basis. We need to increase that number if we're going to take climate change into consideration. And when we say the private sector can come and play ball as well, and then when we talk about the fact that many countries are buckling under debt burdens, the numbers right now seem very daunting. Tidjane, what solutions would you say we need to look at right now and that African governments need to be thinking about?
It's a crucial issue, and you're right to emphasize this. In 2011, so 10 years ago, I chaired the panel for G20, a high-level panel on infrastructure, and we came up with a number of recommendations, including some of those Mark mentioned, leveraging the balance sheets of MFIs to de-risk projects, to provide capital, and I've got to say that has not happened. So the solutions have been on the table for quite a while. What we need is a strong political will to make those things happen. I think we're moving in that direction. Our friend and brother Donald Kaberuka is leading a piece of work on infrastructure, which will be published in May with many others. We know what the answers are. The answers are kind of public-private partnerships. The answers are regulatory reforms by country to ensure to attract private capital, so that the private capital comes in with no fear of being expropriated or not, or contracts being renegotiated in the mid-course. So that regulatory framework is absolutely crucial to attract long-term quality investment in infrastructure. And finally, there's a lot of capital in the world today. Okay, and after the stimulus from the Western countries, it's even more of a case. So the issue is not the availability of capital. It's really priming the pump, in particular with equity capital. And that's a bit technical, but there's a lot of debt floating around. What we need in most African countries is the equity to fund those projects, which also means that in terms of development, we need to encourage the development of pension funds. And may be unrelated, but it's not. One of the best sources of long-term patient capital in economies are pension fund, and we have a positive demography in Africa. Right now, which should open that opportunity. This has been done in Southeast Asia with great success, and Africa should absolutely do the same thing. Anecdotally, I designed initially the third bridge of Abidjan, and you'll find it interesting, but I closed the financing with the Army Pension Fund. They provided the last bit of capital, because infrastructure projects are a key asset in which to invest to face your pension liabilities with cash flows in the long term and matching your asset and liabilities. So there is a comprehensive set of things that need to be done for this to happen. I think this is a good time to do this, and there is a real opportunity to give a major push. And the last thing I would add is probably regional integration, because a lot of those projects are better designed and considered in a regional perspective rather than a country by country perspective where they're not always viable.
Thank you very much, Tidjane. Vera, we've actually heard this argument about mobilizing pension funds for various sectors, but we know we have to spend money on infrastructure, and we know what we need to do to boost economic growth on the continent. How can we ensure that the climate change agenda is included when we are industrializing the continent under the Continental Free Trade Area, as we're building more infrastructure and we're thinking about more processing and manufacturing plants, and we have governments that want to tap into their fossil fuel revenues to be able to do so? It seems like a very difficult conversation to have when you have so many priorities on the agenda. Vera, you're on mute.
Oh, sorry. No, thank you very much. Daniel is here because I'm about to use a South Africa example. So in South Africa, we just did a study with Oxford University and Vivid Economics that shows that, you know, we could actually increase jobs by 420% more if we decided to do more renewable energy, sustainable transport, and nature-based rehabilitation solutions. And why am I using South Africa? Because I think that when we talk particularly about the just transition, one of the countries that is most targeted is South Africa. They have to go from coal. But South Africa has had an amazing experience in terms of renewables. And, you know, South Africa was one of the first countries on the continent that opened its markets to renewables. But when you look at the pricing at the time, it was onerous. And so today, when we talk about reforms in South Africa's energy sector, we are actually saying, you know, at the time, the markets didn't price South Africa right. Because when people bought South Africa paper, as it happens with many of Africa's paper, is our paper is not as liquid. And South Africa is actually one of the better ones. The reinvestment in Africa's economies doesn't happen as fast. As Mark said, $150 billion of Eurobond paper on the continent. Can we translate that into more green and more renewable energy? Yes, we can. But how? One of the things we must do is, as we gather today, you know, interest rates in the developed world are so low that we have to find ways of making sure that some of the resources come back to the continent. Our interest rates, cost of capital are quite high. At the Economic Commission for Africa, we're proposing that some of the market institutions that exist in the West, like repo facilities, which can render our paper much more liquid, so that you can actually reinvest a lot more and blend with the private sector so that you do a lot more, go a lot faster, go a lot quicker. I think a lot of the conversation is about that. Can we get cheap liquidity and can we go quicker? On the cheap liquidity side, we're proposing a liquidity and sustainability facility that should be able to do that. And secondly, when we talk about debt sustainability, and what constrains us a lot is when you have a debt sustainability problem, you lose 2 to 3 years of growth. On our continent, I think sometimes people don't sort of value time. You know, time lost in that sort of lost growth for 2 to 3 years is huge. And we cannot afford that on the continent. We need to find ways of ensuring that, you know, we get the liquidity, we get it in a timely fashion. As Tidjane said, processes and reforms are put in place that deliver on the solutions quickly enough. Now, one of the ways of doing that, and I don't know who sort of made mention of it, is capital going out of the continent during this crisis. We have done so many studies across the world that show that the people who stay, even when there is a crisis, are continental investors, local investors. So we must, and the Economic Commission for Africa is now working on something that we're calling Team Energy Africa, is can we identify a core group of African investors in the energy sector and also invest in them so that they can ensure that there is continuity, so that even when there's a crisis, they don't pull out and then, you know, think of coming back in, but they can stay in. During this crisis alone, almost $30 billion of sort of energy-related investments, $3 billion of energy-related investments left the continent. We cannot afford that. We need those investments to stay. And so we must grow homegrown investors as well. And that will then marry this question of jobs, reforms, investments, climate. You can bring them all together in one. When you say them like that, they look very complicated. But I think in many countries, some of them are coming together in a way that is seamless.
Thank you, Vera. Daniel, we're talking about private sector investment, and we're referring to the private sector being able to plug that gap. I know that you're wanting to spend 100 billion rand or $7 billion on ESG projects by 2025. So that's a significant investment. I guess there's a few questions here. Why allocate this money? Do you see that you could have good return? Is this just about a social investment where you're doing it for the good of the greater, of the continent and future? And how are you viewing this investment from a risk profile perspective?
Thanks, Eleni. I guess the one thing to say, and it's been mentioned previously, that these challenges also beget opportunities. Certainly the amounts that we are allocating there are not sort of social projects. They make good business sense. They will deliver appropriate returns. But I think more overarchingly, our aim is to help customers achieve sustainable and inclusive growth aligned to the objectives that are in the Paris Climate Agreement goals, and to make sure that they can adapt and they can provide services that are very much in line with where we're going. So this is not a social type of thing, it's a business imperative. It brings the right kind of returns, and I think the previous speakers touched on the various issues that are important there in terms of Mark talking about sort of risk management and Vera illustrating very clearly how the South African renewables program showed that when you've got more data, more granular statistics, you are in a much better position to price these risks. And if you look at the first rounds to the subsequent rounds in that renewables program, which Absa was the largest funder of, you could see that the need to require sort of disproportionate compensation for the underlying risks you're taking was diminishing. But certainly, as far as we are concerned, very committed to mobilizing those funds and capitalizing on the infrastructure financing gaps on the continent, and ensuring that whether it's recovering from COVID or generally tuning into what already had been a huge need in Africa for infrastructure finance, or the opportunities that come with the Continental Free Trade Agreement, that as and when we do that, we make sure that this is compatible with sustainability and with the transition goals that we have. We were, as Absa, for instance, the first listed company in South Africa to voluntarily include a climate change resolution on our agenda in the AGM. Last year, we've issued a sustainability policy under which a coal financing standard was issued, and Vera touched on that in terms of our dependency on coal, that going forward we would not be financing coal-fired power plants, but in the process holding our clients' hands and making sure that as we transition, we do that responsibly. And to that effect, just to show you how big it is for us as a business, we have established a sustainable financing team and have committed these amounts that you've mentioned. And so that is absolutely critical for us. So it is not an issue where we think we're playing green. This is business.
Thank you, Daniel. Yeah, there was a time we were always talking about companies doing, greenwashing projects, but this is a sustainable investment. And we're seeing this happening across the continent as well. So Mark, my question to you, when we, in the road to COP26, just how much of a voice does Africa have at the negotiating table? And how can African leaders get involved in policy creation and implementation? And what do you foresee as we head closer to Glasgow?
Well, I think African African leaders have an incredibly important voice and powerful voice in many respects. I think first and foremost, the design of some of what we've been talking about, which is the public finance or the so-called concessional finance, whether it's the on lending of the SDRs, which I think the entire panel is supportive of, and I think is critical to happen. Whether it is the completion of the 100 billion, and whether it's what I was speaking about in my prepared remarks around unlocking the power of the multilateral development banks and development finance system. In other words, following the recommendations that Tidjane had developed several years ago and actually putting them into action. I recall that the opening video put the emphasis not on words, but on action. So putting those recommendations into action. The test, one of the key tests of that, whether that action is impactful, will be in Africa. So it's now, there are two sides to that. So first is active participation in moving from concept to action in all of those regards. The second is on the, if I can put it on the supply side, which is domestic policies and developing the investable projects domestically, so that the capital flows to the areas that will have the maximum impact. I think further, it is important to help develop markets for, including this market for carbon offsets, whether that's ultimately structured under Article 6 or whether it's structured in terms of company demand, voluntary offset markets. Africa should be a major beneficiary of this market and should be demanding that these markets are up and running. They've taken too long to develop. The private sector is now beginning to take matters into their own hands. I think that this can work in a complementary way to the Article 6 work, which is incredibly important to complete. So pushing to make sure that these components of private finance are in place, first and foremost, but in parallel, developing the domestic policy frameworks and, crucially, the domestic projects, large-scale domestic projects that then will pull down this finance and put into action to the benefit of Africans, to benefits of and bridging jobs and growth in the near term for a more sustainable future in the longer term.
Mark, I've got a couple of questions that have come through, and please send us through your comments and any questions you might have for our panel today. Really delighted to be hearing from Dr. Mminele Rampele, and her question is, how are we going to account for the ecosystem services that Africa provides to the rest of the world? And the other question is, how does the finance sector collaborate with African governments in cleaning up legacy problems from extractive mineral sectors across the continent, both from Dr. Rampele. Thank you very much for joining us and watching us today. Who would like to tackle that one? Go for it.
Well, I think this is, thanks very much. I think this is the question around the carbon pricing, and as Mark was saying, I think Article 6, I'm not as an expert, but you know, when you go to the Congo Basin, as I said, 3 years of carbon emissions are being sequestered there. We have been going back and forth on carbon pricing. We, again, did some, quick estimates of if we actually had, even at the $5 pricing that we're talking about now per ton, globally, we can generate $4 billion annually of resources, which could increase Africa's renewable energy by 22% and create 4.5 million jobs, reduce the number of women that are dying. So I really think that one of the big issues that we need to do is see, can we find some carbon offsets? And can we ensure, as Africa goes to COP26, a big discussion, and we're planning a big a meeting in June on the road to COP26, is what do we do with, the Cuvette Centrale in Congo, the peatlands in the Congo Basin, which have, 30 billion tons of carbon emissions sequestered. This is a service to humanity, and we must find some way of remunerating that. The second thing I think is the only way that we stop deforestation on the continent and reduce Africa's contribution, however small it is also beginning to put more of a price on this and making it a private, good. If people begin to realize there is a return to protecting the environment on our continent, as is already clear in most of the advanced economies, I think one can do better. So that I think is really the issue, is we need more analysis and more advocacy behind a carbon price. This is not just about big business. This is also about creating domestic resources for Africa.
For that, Vera. Please send us through your questions, and I'll be posing them to our panel today. Tidjane, if I could get you involved here, let's talk about the key priorities for Africa for COP26. And I'd like to refer back to COP17 that happened here in South Africa, in Durban. And there was a lot of talk, and that's all it really was. We didn't see anything significant that occurred after that. In South Africa, we perhaps diversified away from just coal-fired power plants, but we still heavily reliant on that. In the lead up to COP26, what should countries be specifically looking at in driving the Africa agenda?
I think, thank you, Eleni. I think part of the answer is something we've all said on the panel is really additional resources, material, additional resources, because the tension we all describe between the short term, the little girl who needs light in the morning or in the evening to study, the energy needs, etc., and the population pressure, and the transition to a long-term, clean, inclusive growth is not easy. But I'll come back to a central idea for me, which is not very sexy, but I think is crucial, which is that everybody thinks about this in terms of how do we attract foreign investment, how do we... I still think that the central battleground is the domestic economy. There is no substitute to developing people who are really have a vested interest in the long term of a country than to have successful domestic companies. And maybe I've been very influenced by my work in Asia, but I always... talking a few days ago to the leadership of a company created in 1921 in us two brothers in a little shed selling seeds to farmers in China. And that company has hundreds of billions of dollars of turnover today. Every large company was once small, from Microsoft and Bill Gates in his garage to we can multiply the examples. And this notion that if we want large, responsible African companies, we need to groom small companies first. We don't get big in one day. Companies take 15, 20 years to develop. And really, I just think that it's very important that African leadership focus on those companies. I was 11 years CEO of a Fortune 500. When you come from the outside, the first thing you look at is, are there companies from within that countries who are born there, speak the language, and who've been successful? And frankly, if the answer to that is no, you will not invest. As simple as that. And to partners. So you need companies that have reached a level where if you go to a country and you cannot find a partner, you will not invest. So really, the key to unlock the foreign investment is to really promote that domestic economy, devote a lot of attention to that domestic economy, and then the rest comes as a virtuous circle. And I think that sometimes we're just too focused on jumping to the conclusion that the solution has to come from the outside. The best innovations will come from those companies that are domestically generated and grown. Sorry for a long answer, but it's just a strongly held belief.
Yeah, and I know that Daniel also wants to weigh in here on some of your comments.
No, I just wanted to add to that in terms of leading up to Glasgow and what is pertinent for Africa and African voices and perspectives that need to put in there. I think earlier on we spoke about political will, we spoke about urgency, and if you want things about, you referred back to COP17 in Durban, the Paris Climate Agreement, we're basically lagging behind our own commitments. But I think apart from the integrated approach that we talked about, the need for more resourcing and targeted as they need to be, as Mark said, I think one of the issues that is very important to take into account is the issue of appropriate sequencing and taking into account country-specific considerations and having clear transition plans and making sure that we don't end up with too stringent or unduly rushed implementation with regard to what we've committed to in such a manner that we could inadvertently put sort of financial sectors and economies at risk. So there is a need for us to sequence this transition in order to make sure that we do safeguard livelihoods and have to avoid any situations that could be almost binary, if you wish, where countries have to choose between sort of a climate crisis and or an economic one. So it's very, very important that as we address this, as has been said, that the regulatory and policy environment and decisions is appropriately calibrated to this, because they can have significant unintended consequences.
Mark, I want to talk about offsets, and we've, of course, spoken about carbon credits quite a bit, but let's look at exactly what is in store in the next few years. Are we still just talking about it, or are we going to see actual policy in the next year?
Yeah, and let me first let me associate myself with Vera's comments in terms of the incredible service that is provided the existing natural capital in Africa, and so the opportunity from emission reduction avoidance there, but then also to grow that through reforestation. There's tremendous amount of action in place. There's a Winters Commission that is underway. It's published a blueprint for a new voluntary carbon offset market. There are 50 core members of that group that are working, but really it's almost 150 institutions that are involved from the private sector through to the NGO community that are turning that blueprint into action through 6 different work streams. And at the heart of this work is work on market integrity, all aspects of market integrity. So you have the classic issues of market integrity in terms of pre and post-trade settlement, central counterparties, transparency in terms of the market structure. You have to have that. You don't, by the way, have that in the existing informal market that exists today and is very small. But critically, we need integrity around the offsets themselves. What is being established is a series of core carbon principles, what defines an offset, how they are certified, and the degree of permanence of the offset and the verification and the monitoring of that permanence. In parallel, a new governance framework is being set up, not just for the supply, but also very importantly for those who would buy the offsets. And remember, as this is a private market, so it would be purchased by companies that are making these net zero commitments as a complement to their absolute emission reductions. The CEO, the CFO of major corporations, whether it's Microsoft or Unilever or others who have these net zero commitments, they are not going to sign off on their accounts unless they know that the reforestation project, be it in Rwanda or somewhere else in Africa, exists, whether the peatland is being preserved, whether the renewable power opportunity is being converted into fact. So that just gives you the tip of the iceberg of some of the work that's being done. Some of it's incredibly technical, but that's what's necessary to create a robust, resilient, and large-scale market quickly. We have, in my judgment, the best in the industry and from the NGO community working in common purpose to develop this market, turn this blueprint into reality. The target is to have a pilot market up and running by the end of the year, and then to scale it. And of course, the first best situation would be successful conclusion of the Article 6 negotiations, and then the accounting on the country level and the accounting on the company level would be brought together, and this market would move quickly with material flows into solutions in Africa.
Tidjane, over to you, and you mentioned something that really struck me, and of course we've been talking about it since the start of the pandemic, is that we're taking many steps backwards. In fact, we've seen reversal of so many gains that have been made over the past decade on the continent, whether it's investing in climate change or inequality, bringing down the inequality gap. You're doing a lot of work with African countries at the moment. Is climate on the agenda? Are you hearing that countries and governments want to spend on this item right now? And what are you telling them at the moment?
Look, it's a very important point you're making. The problem with crisis is that they hit the most vulnerable first. So, of course, in COVID, the most vulnerable groups, the women, the unemployed have been hit, the kind of so-called informal sector have been hit the hardest. So I think it's important that the policy response is always two-dimensional. You have to look at the short term and the long term, and it's a false dichotomy to try to oppose both, because you only get there if you manage both well. It's important to manage the short term effectively so that there is a long term, but it's important as you manage the short term not to compromise the long term. So really the dialogue we're having with the countries is very rational. I mean, the Ministry of Finances, the people we talk to are very aware of both obligations. So if you look at the debt, for instance, the DSSI was very much aimed at the short term, and the debt, the common framework, which has been now developed, adopted by the G20, that China has joined for the first time, is very much aimed at bringing a comprehensive, sustainable solution to increase the resilience of those countries. But yeah, is there a risk that the emphasis on climate is less? Yes. But I think it's incumbent on all of us to make sure that the appropriate focus is maintained. And having COP26, frankly, is very timely because it allows conversations like the one we have today, and it allows everybody to stay focused on kind of quality long-term solutions, which are really the only way to get through this.
Running out of time, but we've got quite a few questions that have just popped in from the audience. And Daniel, I'd like to pose some of them to you. And this is one that we have, perhaps as South Africans we can relate to. It's from Nicole Martins. Do we see emerging African markets having political will to transition given vested interests in SOEs? It's an interesting question to look at from a macro perspective. Do you have thoughts on that and how we can get the policy and the will, the government to want to transition?
Look, I think, Eleni, the diagnosis is fairly clear and it is quite dire. And we all know we are on a back foot. So I don't think the issue of will, of political will and the need for the actions that we need to take are at issue at all. We just need to implement. I mean, a number of initiatives were touched upon today just in terms of reports, commissions, projects, initiatives that are on the go on the continent. So it's really just relentless implementation and understanding that our sense of urgency needs to go up. So I don't think there is an issue where sort of vested interests are sort of harming us. Obviously, the sequencing and how quickly one does it and is something that needs to be looked at. But it's really an issue of urgency of getting these programs that we've got underway. And as we've said earlier, the big elephant in the room is resourcing and getting the resources that will allow the correct kind of incentivization and making people understand that it is in their best term interest and long-term interest to become involved and afford this a higher level of urgency. So from that perspective, I think from a macro perspective, a number of countries are adopting net zero targets and are embedding lots of what we're talking about into policy frameworks. But it's really understanding that we really don't have time. It's urgent and we need to act now.
Vera, let's go to a policy expert that is helping guide policy on the continent. Vera, yes, I'm talking to you. I've got so much to still ask you. And look, I know you've been involved in capacity building to strengthen the continent's climate change agenda. I'm curious about what you've been doing with ClimDev Africa. I'm also wondering about the framework of the Paris Agreement and how we can ensure that we take measures to be able to implement the commitments that we would like to fulfill. You know, what are you guys doing in the background to achieve when we talk about the transition to net zero?
Thank you, Eleni. Thanks for that question. But just before I come to your answer, let me just go back to the question you asked, Daniel. I think a lot of times, and because of our audience, there's always this sense that, you know, it's the Africans that need to do a lot more and that the rest of the world is equipped for us. And I don't think so. And then let me just give you 3 examples. You know, today on the continent, we only have 2 energy utilities that are actually making profits or in sort of the positive category. But this is not entirely because these utilities, the rest of the utilities are poorly run. It's because the financing is misaligned. We have 7-year financing for 13-year or 30-year projects. And so we just do not have the right kind of alignment of the financing. The financing comes from the private sector, it comes from FDI. And so we need to figure out, you know, how do we realign make some of this financing more long-term, make it cheaper, yes, with local pension funds, but also providing more liquidity to the continent. So I think, again, it's a two-part question. On the second piece, a lot of the investment in the energy sector, let's take that again, because we now know, and many African countries, over half of the African countries now have done independent power producing agreements. We know how to do it. We know how to get private sector investment into the energy sector. But the developed community continues to invest in generation with concessional funding. The private sector can do that and does that very well. We need to be doing the backbone. We need to be doing the last mile with concessional money and let the private sector come in and fill those gaps where we now know the rate of return is good and can happen. And I think there again, it's not about vested interest as the question was posed, or maybe it's vested interest on both sides. On the development side, that doesn't want to do the more risky things. In Rwanda today, for example, we have everybody's investing in generation. We should be investing in the last mile. So I think, until we begin to see the problem as all of us coming together, not just the Africans needing to do reform and the Africans needing to fix, but I think the whole system needs to be fixed, both from the private investor side, from the multilateral development agency side, and from our countries. So I just wanted to put that on the table and so that when we come back, we can think about it. Because if we only think about it as Africa has to do something for everybody else to come, we will never find the right solution. Africa has done a lot, but everybody has to come together to do this. Now, in terms of what we are doing, I think Paris was a great moment, and many of the countries came together and provided their NDCs and their national determined contributions, what they plan to do. But this was on the promise of $100 billion every year to do different things. That never came. I think what is now happening is countries are realizing that it is in their best interest to move into more sustainable development. And so a lot of the work that we're doing with CleanDev and GAC, with Ban Ki-moon and the African Development Bank and others, is to say, how can we work on adaptation? What do we still need to do in the agriculture sector using better technology to ensure that countries begin to understand that, climate change is not about some onerous imposition from the external world, but it is about how you grow better, how you increase productivity and create prosperity in a way that is much faster. And I think that's the work that this country case studies we're doing with Oxford University is really about. That is to say, let's take South Africa, let's take Cote d'Ivoire. We just did one for DRC. 130% more jobs can be done if you grow green, and we have the sectors. So I think a lot more analytical work where you can say it is in this sector. This is what you can do. It's in this piece. This is what you can do. This is the return. This is how it works. And we're seeing, even in South Africa, we're talking all the way up to the presidency and the government. They're getting interested in saying, so we can realign policy in these areas. And we don't go in by saying you must do green. We're going in by saying you have to create more jobs. And everybody comes to the table when you talk about creating more jobs. And I think between creating more jobs, doing the NDCs, I think we find a good marriage with CleanDev and the rest to work on. Thank you.
Absolutely, and aligning, absolutely, and just aligning all the priorities. We're going to start wrapping up, and I just would like last comments from you, Mark. I'll go to Tidjane, and then Daniel will close. So, Mark.
Well, first, I want to thank you and Daniel for hosting this excellent discussion. I think hopefully the tone that everyone sees is the urgency of the issue, the breadth of potential initiatives, and that we're poised for action. And indeed, there's action on the ground. We've got to use this time effectively to move forward. And again, to underscore, this will deliver. This agenda will deliver in the short term and for the long term, but it will deliver in the short term if we do it right. Thanks.
Thank you, Tidjane.
Thanks, Eleni. I think we see sadly. We see sadly with COVID. What happens to the world when there is not coordinated and decisive action. So it is really my hope that climate benefits from the sad lesson of COVID, and that people tackle the issues with a sense of urgency and the appropriate level of coordination around the world, because if anybody is left behind, in the end we all share the same climate and it's not going to work. So it has to be a global concerted action. Thank you.
And Daniel, I was in Tsitsikamma a few months ago, and I saw these incredible wind turbines. And I've been to the Northern Cape, and I've seen the incredible solar plants. And there are such amazing investments within the cleaner and greener space. And I know that financial institutions are looking at these viable, bankable projects. As we close this discussion, how are you feeling in terms of optimism that we can get this right, that this climate agenda is not going to fall by the wayside?
No, certainly in terms of what you're touching on, if you look at a country like South Africa, we really have ideal conditions for wind power and certainly solar power for sure. And we certainly as a group are gearing up to support various sort of transitions in terms of moving away from coal-powered power station. I mentioned earlier on that with these successive rounds of renewable energy projects that Vera cited as a very successful way of doing that, Absa has been the largest funders of these projects. So we're certainly looking forward to play our role, and our interests are fully aligned with the transition and our strategic objectives.
That's fantastic. So Daniel, thank you very much for hosting this discussion, and to Absa Group. It has been truly illuminating to hear all of your comments and the way forward as we engage with thought leaders on the road to COP26. And thank you to you, Daniel. I know that, you know, taking on the CEO job at Absa Group just before the pandemic, there's so many other priorities, but it's incredible to see you engaged in the climate change agenda on the continent.
Thank you.
Thank you. So thank you very much to all of you for watching at home. Thank you for joining us, to all our panelists. And we'll see you in November, maybe in person in Glasgow, who knows, but hopefully in better times. All the best. Thank you.
How lucky we are to call this beautiful continent home. Yes, this paradise is not without peril, but just look at what we have to work with. In the years to come, this responsibility will fall to you, and all its potential will be your possibility. So we promise to do all we can today to share all our knowledge and skills, to ensure you inherit a just society, to give you access to the finance and resources you need to build the best Africa possible. But none of that will matter if we don't protect this beautiful continent we call home. And so we pledge to use every ounce of our creativity, our ingenuity, our tenacity, all 37,000 of us, shoulder to shoulder with millions of you, to bring the most important possibility of our time to life. So your world, dear tomorrow, is shaped by the power of zero.